All right, so today we are diving into a topic that I think has the potential to reshape the whole war in Ukraine, and that's long-range missiles. You sent over a bunch of articles on President Biden's recent authorization for Ukraine to use U.S.-supplied ATACMS, and that's the Army Tactical Missile System, against targets inside Russia. This is something that's generating a lot of discussion, and for good reason. We're talking about missiles that have a range of up to 190 miles, which could really change things for Ukraine's ability to go on the offensive.
Yeah, and I think what's important to remember here is that this decision represents a pretty significant shift in how the U.S. has been involved in this whole conflict.
Yeah.
Up until now, there's been this hesitancy to give Ukraine weapons that could actually strike deep into Russia because they've been worried about making the whole conflict worse. So this authorization just throws a wrench into how the war is playing out, especially since we also have a new U.S. administration about to take over.
Totally. And with President-elect Trump having said before that he might actually reduce aid to Ukraine, the timing of this is really interesting. So let's just break this down a little bit. For those of us who need a refresher, how would these ATACMS actually change what's happening on the ground? What sort of targets are we talking about here?
Okay, so imagine you're a Ukrainian military strategist and you're looking at a map. Before this, your ability to hit Russian targets was limited to a certain area. But with these APCS, that area suddenly gets way bigger. You can potentially hit things like command centers way behind the front lines, supply depots, places where they have all their supplies, logistical hubs, even air bases in the Kursk region, which is where Ukraine thinks Russia might launch a big counteroffensive from. So being able to disrupt Russia's ability to fight the war from far away is a really tempting possibility.
Yeah, that sounds like it could be a real game changer for Ukraine, hitting Russia where it hurts. But some of the articles that you sent over said that it might not be the magic solution that people are hoping for. So what are the arguments against giving Ukraine this kind of firepower?
Well, there are a few main points that people are skeptical about. So first of all, whether ATACMS will actually be effective kind of depends on whether Russia has been caught off guard or not. If they saw this coming and moved all their important stuff out of range, then the impact could be way less than people are hoping for. And second, we don't actually know how many of these ATACMS they are sending. If it's just a small number, it might not be enough to change the battlefield that much.
That makes sense. It all comes down to how Russia adapts and whether Ukraine has enough missiles to really make a difference. But there's another layer to this, right? France and the UK have already given Ukraine similar long-range missiles, but they've been hesitant to let Ukraine actually use them against targets inside Russia without the US saying it's okay. Now that Biden has given the green light, could this change their minds? And could we see even more of these long-range weapons going to Ukraine?
That is the big question. If France and the UK do decide to follow the US's lead, then Ukraine's ability to launch attacks from far away gets a massive boost, and that means they could potentially carry out sustained attacks deep inside Russia. But it also raises the stakes significantly. Russia has said multiple times that letting Ukraine hit targets inside Russia is crossing a line, and they see it as basically a direct attack by NATO.
So we've got Ukraine potentially getting this powerful new tool, but at the risk of making Russia really angry and escalating things even further. And all this is happening just as we have a new president about to take office, one who has said he wants to do things differently when it comes to this conflict. So how does this decision by Biden affect the incoming Trump administration? Could this be seen as tying their hands, or even boxing them into a certain approach?
It definitely makes things more complicated for the new administration. During his campaign, President-elect Trump talked about reducing how involved the U.S. is in the Ukraine conflict. He even suggested that maybe he would try to negotiate some kind of peace deal. But this decision by Biden kind of changes the reality of the situation. It might make it harder for Trump to just step back from supporting Ukraine. Some people might even see it as Biden trying to lock in U.S. support for Ukraine before Trump takes over and potentially changes things.
It's almost like Biden is setting up the chessboard a certain way before letting the next player take over. And Russia is watching all of this very closely, trying to figure out what its next move should be. So how have they reacted so far to this authorization of these ATCMS and TAL?
Russia's response has been a mix of warnings and rhetoric. They've been trying to make people think that this could lead to a much bigger war. They've even talked about the possibility of World War III. And they're accusing NATO of being directly involved in the fighting. Which isn't really surprising because Russia has always said that the West giving military aid to Ukraine is an existential threat to them, like it's a fight for their survival. Putin himself has been very vocal about this. He said that letting Ukraine use Western weapons to hit targets deep inside Russia is crossing a red line, which basically means they're not going to just sit back and let that happen.
So we've got the U.S. seemingly stepping up its support for Ukraine, Russia making threats, and a new president about to step into the situation, which is already incredibly tense. It feels like one of those moments in history where things could go in a lot of different directions. Before we move on, is there anything else about Russia's response that we should point out to our listener? Anything that really stood out to you?
What I think is especially interesting is that Russia's response isn't just talk. There's evidence that they're actually doing things to try to protect themselves from these ATACMS. Like satellite images show that they've started spreading out their important military stuff and making them harder to hit with these long-range missiles. They're also beefing up their air defenses and deploying more of these electronic warfare systems. So what this tells me is that even though Russia is making a lot of noise publicly, they're taking this threat seriously, and they're actually changing how their military is positioned because of it.
That's a really important point. It seems like Russia is playing this double game, making threats publicly, but also making changes behind the scenes to protect themselves. So on one hand, you've got these long-range missiles that could help Ukraine, and on the other hand, you have Russia actively trying to counter that threat. It makes the situation on the battlefield really interesting, doesn't it?
It does. And this is just one part of a much bigger geopolitical puzzle. The situation in Ukraine is connected to power dynamics all over the world. And what happens in one place can have ripple effects everywhere else. Take North Korea, for example.
Okay, now you're going to have to help me connect the dots here. What does North Korea have to do with all of this? It seems like we're suddenly jumping to a completely different part of the world.
I know it might seem that way, but just stay with me for a second. There's more and more evidence suggesting that North Korea has been quietly giving Russia things like artillery shells and other weapons,
Yeah.
probably in exchange for money or maybe even some advanced technology. And some people think that Biden's decision to give Ukraine these ATACMS might be partly a response to this growing involvement from North Korea.
So you're saying that Biden authorizing these long-range missiles could be a way of sending a message, not just to Russia, but also to North Korea, like saying, hey, we see what you're doing and there will be consequences.
Exactly. It shows how these conflicts that seem totally separate can actually be connected.
It's like a giant game of 3D chess being played out all over the world. And it seems like we're only just starting to understand what this decision about the ATMS really means. It's a move that could have consequences that reach far beyond the war in Ukraine. It could affect the whole geopolitical landscape. So before we go any deeper into the potential consequences of all of this, let's pause here for a second and let our listeners absorb this first layer of information.
So before we went off on that tangent about North Korea, we were talking about the potential impact of the new Trump administration on what happens in Ukraine. And that's where things get really interesting, don't they?
Yeah, for sure. We've got this huge decision to give Ukraine these long-range missiles, but at the same time, we have this new administration coming in, and they might have completely different ideas about how involved the U.S. should be in this whole thing. During his campaign, President-elect Trump was pretty clear that he wanted to reduce U.S. support for Ukraine. He even talked about trying to work out a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. So do you think he's actually going to follow through on those campaign promises?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's the one that everyone's trying to figure out. So Trump has this history of saying one thing during the campaign and then doing something completely different once he's actually in office.
Yeah, it's like trying to predict the weather weeks in advance. You never really know what's going to happen. But Trump has always been kind of skeptical about getting the U.S. involved in conflicts overseas. And he's said he wants to have a better relationship with Russia. So it seems pretty likely that he's going to change how the U.S. approaches the war in Ukraine, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's definitely a good chance that we'll see a policy shift. I don't think Trump is going to completely abandon Ukraine, but he might reduce the amount of military and financial aid they're getting, and he could put pressure on them to negotiate a peace deal, even if it means Ukraine has to give up things they don't want to.
So let's say that happens. What if Trump scales back U.S. support? Can Ukraine actually hold out against Russia without that help from America?
That's a really tough question to answer. Ukraine has been depending heavily on the West, not just for weapons, but also for money. Their economy is a mess because of the war. And without help from the West, it's going to be incredibly difficult for them. It really comes down to a few things. Will other countries step up and give Ukraine the support that the U.S. is no longer providing? Will the Ukrainian people be able to keep fighting? And how determined is Russia to keep fighting no matter what?
So basically, the future of Ukraine might come down to what the new Trump administration decides to do.
It's a big responsibility.
And speaking of other players in this whole situation, what about NATO? How are they reacting to everything that's happening, especially now that the U.S. has given Ukraine the okay to launch attacks inside Russia?
NATO has been trying to walk this fine line since the conflict started. They want to support Ukraine, but they also don't want to start a war with Russia. And this decision by Biden just makes things even more complicated for them.
Right, it's like adding another spinning plate to the stack. Some NATO members have been really cautious about giving Ukraine certain types of weapons because they're worried about provoking Russia. Now that the U.S. is pushing the boundaries, could this cause problems within NATO? Could we see some countries wanting to escalate things while others want to be more careful?
Yeah, that's definitely something to keep an eye on. NATO has been pretty united so far in how they've responded to Russia's invasion.
Mm.
But keeping that unity going as the war drags on and costs keep rising is going to be tough. This decision about the ATAT-CMS could make things worse.
It's like Biden threw a grenade into this already volatile situation and then walked away. We don't know what's going to happen, but it's definitely going to shake things up.
That's a bold move for sure.
And beyond the immediate consequences, there's a bigger question here. What does this whole thing tell us about how war is changing? Are we moving towards a world where countries are fighting each other from farther and farther away, and the lines between conventional and unconventional warfare are getting blurrier?
That's a great point. And it's something that military experts everywhere are trying to figure out.
Being able to hit targets deep inside enemy territory has become much easier. But it also raises some really complicated questions about ethics and international law.
Exactly. If you can take out your enemy's command centers, their supply lines, their critical infrastructure, all from a distance, it gives you a huge advantage. But what are the rules in those situations? What happens when civilians get caught in the crossfire? These are questions that need to be discussed seriously on an international level.
It feels like we're entering a new era of warfare, one where traditional military tactics are being combined with these advanced long-range capabilities.
Absolutely. And what Biden has done with these ATAN-CMS could be a major step in that direction.
So we've talked about the immediate impact of these missiles, the potential responses from Russia and the incoming Trump administration, what this means for NATO, and even the bigger picture of how war itself is evolving. But it's important to remember that this isn't just some theoretical discussion.
Oh, I completely agree.
These are real-world decisions with real-world consequences for people's lives.
You're absolutely right. We can't forget about the human cost of this conflict. Millions of Ukrainians have lost their homes, countless people have died, and the effects of this war will be felt for generations. It's a reminder that the decisions made by people in power have a huge impact on ordinary people.
And as we try to make sense of all these complicated issues, we need to do it with empathy and a real understanding of how this conflict is affecting people's lives.
I couldn't agree more. It's easy to get lost in the strategy and the politics. But we have to remember that this is ultimately about people. Their lives, their hopes, their dreams, their futures.
Well said. So where do we go from here? We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much uncertainty.
Yeah, there really is.
What are the big questions that we should be asking ourselves as we try to figure out what's going on?
Yeah, that's really the core of it all, isn't it? And we've looked at what these long-range missiles could mean on the battlefield. We've talked about how Russia might react and the whole question mark surrounding the incoming Trump administration. And we even touched on the bigger ripple effects this could have around the world. But now it's about figuring out what it all means for the future.
Right, and this is where I think it's really important to bring the listener into the conversation. We've thrown a lot of information at you, but what are your takeaways? What really stuck with you? I mean, we talked about how these ATAS-CMS could give Ukraine an advantage, but also how it could make things even worse between Russia and the West. We talked about how unpredictable the new Trump administration might be when it comes to foreign policy. And we even touched on what all of this means for NATO and the future of war itself. It's a lot to take in, so I'm curious what's going through your mind right now.
I think for me, the biggest theme here is uncertainty. We're at this really crucial point, not just in the war in Ukraine, but in global power dynamics overall.
Yeah, it feels like the stakes have just gotten so much higher. Like one wrong move could have huge consequences.
Exactly, and that's what keeps me up at night thinking about all this. How does this decision affect the chances for peace in the long run? Does giving Ukraine the power to hit targets inside Russia make it more likely that they'll negotiate a settlement? Or does it actually make peace harder to achieve?
And I think it's crucial to remember that this isn't happening in a vacuum. This decision about the ATAS-CMS is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. We have these shifting alliances all over the world. rising nationalism, and this growing lack of trust between the major powers, it feels like the old rules don't apply anymore.
Yeah, it's a totally different world.
And the possibility of conflict, whether it's intentional or accidental, feels much higher than it used to.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. This isn't just about a new weapon being used in a war. It's about the fundamental forces that are shaping the world order in the 21st century. And the choices being made right now in Washington, Moscow, Kyiv, and everywhere else are going to have huge and long-lasting effects.
So where do we go from here? We've explored all these complexities and uncertainties, the potential risks and rewards. But what does it mean for you, the listener? How can you use all this information to engage with this issue in a more informed and thoughtful way?
It comes down to staying informed, asking questions, and being willing to challenge your own assumptions. It's about understanding that there are many different perspectives on these complex issues and being open to hearing viewpoints that might be different from your own.
I love that idea of informed engagement. It's not about knowing all the answers. It's about being okay with the fact that things are complicated and actively participating in the conversation. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking question to consider. Imagine you're advising the new Trump administration on how to approach Ukraine. Knowing everything we've discussed today about the situation on the ground, the risks and benefits of different strategies, what advice would you give? Would you recommend that the U.S. keep sending military aid to Ukraine? Would you push for a negotiated settlement? Or would you suggest something completely different? There are no easy answers here, but it's a question that's worth thinking about as we try to navigate this uncertain future. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, so stay tuned.